Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we are going to be going over Bone Curse, Rip Blood, Explosion, Wrong Warp, Movement Speed, Stacking, Lich. So, the concept around this build is kind of simple. It's the future of Last Epoch, at least in the current state of things. So, recently, I have been a very big proponent towards not having the objective rush meta be a thing, as I think it's a really toxic meta because it essentially makes you want to build as much movement speed as humanly possible with the detriment to your character's stats, like using movement speed items. And this is essentially my response to that. So if I'm going to spend hours and hours and hours trying to farm uniques for my builds and all that, I'm probably going to end up playing a very efficient build like this, where I stack as much movement speed as possible and farm out whatever I need, because it is significantly faster to hop onto this character, farm out my LP boots I'm trying to find for my new random character, and then move back to said character, because guess what? Speed is king, especially in this patch's meta. That is mainly because of the existence of chests inside the monoliths and, of course, the mages inside the monolith, which reward you for doing as many echoes as humanly possible, meaning that to do as many echoes as humanly possible, not only do you need to be really fast, you also need to deal a lot of damage, and this is definitely one of those builds. And that is because, of course, we're playing the normal setup on Crit Lich, but with a little bit of a twist. That is because of the new unique called Wrong Warp. Now, if you don't know what Wrong Warp does, essentially what it does is it turns your movement skill, Transplant or Teleport, into a gigantic buff skill. It gives you a large amount of cast speed, movement speed, and damage. And all of that combined allows you to essentially scale yourself to the moon. In this setup, I actually hit a Wrong Warp with cast speed, which is your preferred affix on this build specifically, as it synergizes really well with Rip Blood's node that gives you flat damage per time you've casted Rip Blood recently, and all of that combined allows this build to essentially push into endgame without too much investment into gearing and all that. That's because, guess what? Movement speed stacking is really strong when you get 3% increased spell damage per movement speed. Right now, at my camp, I'm at 160% movement speed while moving through the Monolith of Fate. That is about like 400 to 500-ish% increased damage constantly for my spells. And turns out that is insanely strong out of one item. This wand is insane. It is going to be one of the premier chase items for later on. As you can tell, the random teleports don't really matter because one, you stun enemies nearby you, which is amazing, by the way. It's actually a really good tool on bosses because it's kind of like snap freeze in that regard, right? And also, as well, just guess what? Damage is really good. And instead of using a movement skill, you just move really fast. And turns out moving really fast is a lot more reliable than trying to spam with movement skills, especially if you're playing a build like this where you're trying to clear the monolith as you go to get as much stability as possible. Because guess what? We still want stability, right? We still want to be able to kill stuff on the way, and that a lot of the build is built around that. So first things off, we have Death Seal with the, of course, the death wave setup, and we have it physical based mainly because of the chest that I currently have on has a lot of physical crit on it, so we focused on physical this time around. Yes, you could play this build as necrotic if you wanted to go that route. It's really up to you. I just decided to slam my 4 LP Falcon with this instead. So of course, Death Wave does a decent chunk of damage, but we're also utilizing the Bone Curse Aura tech. So Bone Curse can be turned into an aura, of course, and that means that whenever we're, death waving across packs and stuff, our Bone Curse explosions are always in, like, they're always turned on. As long as we're nearby the enemy, our Bone Curses are always turned on, meaning that we always get the benefit from Bone Curse, including the explosions, the extra damage, and the coal, which is pretty cool as it allows us to simply turn off our brain while doing monoliths, as you can tell in certain monos. Like, we're just deleting packs of enemies like it's nothing for the most part. Now, of course, there are certain enemies that will, that won't die to our insta death stuff, but it doesn't really matter because those mobs aren't really efficient to kill for stability, anyways. The only thing we care about are like packs of spiders and like the shitty little things that you kill for stability. So turns out it ends up working pretty well. And whenever we don't have, of course, our death seal up, we also have access to transplant, which not only does a decent amount of damage, it also casts 3 Rip Bloods for us, which then can proc on kill, and all of this combined just leads to a very smooth amount of gameplay. This build is not meant for bossing. You're not supposed to do tier 4 Jurla with this. This build is also not meant for doing high corruption. This build is meant to do low corruption, about like 300, 400, very, very, very fast, so that you can farm stuff like, of course, your unique items and stuff like that, or you can farm uniques from bosses and stuff like that. That's the whole concept of this build, and that's what I'm going to probably be using it for the future, as guess what? I need a lot of items for how many builds I'm playing constantly. Now, there's two things I need to talk about before we wrap up the intro for this build. First things off, this is not a cheap build. I have Wrong Warp with cast speed. That is a 1 in 4. Wrong Warp is a chase item. It has a really high LP requirement, so don't expect to get a Wrong Warp with cast speed. But guess what? You don't really need a Wrong Warp with cast speed. You just need more cast speed on gear, which I don't have because I don't need it because I have a Wrong Warp with cast speed, right? Uh, I also have a 4 LP Falcon. You do not need a Falcon at all. Falcon is absolute overkill for this build. I just did it because guess what? I'm going to be investing a lot of time in this character, so of course I'm going to put in a 4 LP Falcon. I also have a pair of double movement speed boots. These could just be exalted movement speed boots with HP and stuff, and that would actually lend itself to a little bit of higher corruption. If you ended up making the build a little bit tankier by adding a little bit more HP, you would actually be able to do a bit higher corruption, get a little bit of extra damage scaling, stuff like that. So it's not like as if I couldn't do higher corruption. It's just there's probably more efficient builds to do higher corruption, but this build's really, really good at doing low corruption really, really fast, thanks to all the explosions, procs, everything. And then, of course, as well, I want to say this build does have one very significant weakness. So if you are being hit with very small hits very fast, you will die. That is because of the Bone Curse aura. Bone Curse aura, essentially what it means is whenever you get hit, you are procced with Bone Curse by enemies. Now, if the enemy shoots 15 projectiles, that means it's going to proc Bone Curse 15 times in a row. I kept wondering why I died recently with this build, and it was, oh yeah, it was because of Bone Curse. Oh, it was because of Bone Curse. This build is actually really tanky for the content, right? But it turns out when you scale your own damage to the moon and then apply damage to yourself, you die sometimes. So you got to be very aware of what kind of enemies can proc your Bone Curse very quickly and make sure that you essentially dodge those, right? You don't want to be sitting in those, which is very easy to do considering because not only can you transplant on top of them to freeze them, you can also, of course, just simply move out of the way because guess what? You know, like your teleport is still a dodge and you have an insane amount of movement speed. So overall, I really enjoyed the build. This is definitely what I would call a blaster. If you are from Path of Exile, this is the kind of build for you probably. Now, with all that being said, if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that's the best way of supporting me currently. And of course, now let's go in game for that detailed explanation. Alright, here we are in game with the character. Let's go about some skills, shall we? So the first skill that's important is, of course, Death Seal. It is your stereotypical Death Seal setup where we go for Mortal Pulse to spam as many of these blood waves as possible because as we are moving through the Monolith of Fate, we want to trigger our Bone Curse and cause explosions so that, of course, our clear is phenomenal on all the random crappy mobs so that we get as much stability for free. We're just moving through the Monolith as possible. So we want to be proccing this death wave as much as possible, but we do also want to be doing damage with said death wave because it does actually do damage, turns out. So we are going to be turning it into physical damage. This is only because I hit physical crit on my chest and my helmet. If you were to play, of course, necrotic crit, you could get away with not spending these 2 extra points. It's really up to you on that regard. And of course, the normal setup with the Deathlock, and that's pretty much it for that. For a Reaper form, it's the same stereotypical setup. The only difference here, specifically, is we are not going for Unholy Dominion because it turns out when you have, like, insane amounts of movement speed. I'm talking like 160 plus shenaniganry. It is literally faster to walk than it is to reap because reap doesn't really go that far. Now, we could invest points into making reap go significantly farther and stuff like that, but it's not worth the points as I'd rather go for the mark for death, go for the armor per intelligence, and for the cast speed, the swiftness, all of that. I'd rather go for all of that instead. So that's what we're doing with our current Reaper form. Bone Curse here. Bone Curse is pretty stereotypical. We're grabbing the Armor Shred chance because I needed a little bit more Armor Shred because we're not hitting as much on a single target. We go for the explosions because this is the main reason why our clear feels so good. Then, of course, you take 1 point to Signet of Agony, then go for the 39% more damage. Eventually, we can get plus levels to Bone Curse and grab Iron Maiden, and that would be really good as well. And all of that combined would make your Bone Curse a really good aura. Like I said, the only problem with this is the fact that guess what? You can actually kill yourself with Bone Curse's aura. And eventually, you can actually manage to get a little bit more armor shred on your gloves, and you could dump these points and put them through an area into more damage, stuff like that. But the armor shred is pretty good early on when you don't have the best gear. Then we have Transplant here. Transplant's pretty stereotypical. We want the haste and the frenzy, the rip blood cast. We're going for as much damage on our transplant as possible because transplant is our essentially our backup plan. If of course death seal is down, transplant casting rip blood, and of course doing a bunch of damage is our backup plan to blow up packs while we're waiting for Death Seal to come back up, and it works pretty well at that. We also grab stuff like Flesh Marquee for even more damage on single target, and all of that combined means that we do plenty of damage with our transplant. Now, of course, you can't really rely on said transplant, and that is mainly due, in fact, one, the cooldown recovery speed on Wrong Warp, the last line, the cooldown recovery speed for teleport and transplant is not properly working, as I can prove it to you. 3.7 to 4.1. That is not 50% increased cooldown. 50% increased cooldown would bring it all the way down to like 3.5, 3.4, 3.3, 3.2. It would not bring it only down like 0.4. It would bring it down significantly more than that. So that is not currently working properly. And also as well, it shoots you at a random direction, meaning it's not very, what would you call it, reliable on bosses. So do not use it for like bosses in that regard. Don't try to use it for damage for bosses. There are better builds for that. And that's pretty much it for transplant. Now for rip blood, we mainly care about getting the flat damage on arcane absorption. This is the payoff for having a wrong warp with cast speed because we want as much cast speed as possible, of course, so that we can stack as much flat damage as possible and to get a lot of damage because of that, which is great. Then, of course, we also get the more damage. We grab the explosions on kill. We don't actually need blood orbs at all. So having this means that they can chain on enemies and kill packs very quickly. Then, of course, we grab Splatter because this is really good at proccing bone curses when you're in a pack. And overall, it just leads to very nice and satisfying explosions. And that's pretty much it for the skills. Let's talk about noteworthy passives. So for the passive tree, this part doesn't really matter as much. You just want as much HP, armor, and resistance as possible. For Lich here, we want as much HP as possible to make up for the fact we don't have that much HP on gear. We still grab necrotic energy because flat damage is flat damage, and we're scaling everything pretty generically for the most part because this physical crit on our gear, it doesn't care what kind of flat damage we're dealing. It only cares that our skills are physical. So you can get as much necrotic or whatever flat you want as possible, and it'd be great. The increased damage, the vitality for even more HP, the physical penetration is pretty huge, right? The crit chance, the attack and cast speed, the crit multi. The more cast speed we get, the more multiplicative damage we get from, of course, Rip Blood, giving us more flat damage, right? Increased spell damage. Like, we just want as much damage as humanly possible. Now, as you can tell, whenever I use my wrong warp and also set up everything, I get like well over like I think like 662% increased damage. And of course, when we turn on our Death Seal, it gets the more damage and it goes over the moon, as you can tell, which is really good. And that's enough damage to simply blow up everything that we need to when we need to, which is great. And that's pretty much it for the passives. Now let's talk about some gearing and some blessings. So for blessings here, I went, of course, for crit multi because crit multi is good. Uh, Lightning res on Lagan, Reign of Dragons crit avoidance, armor and armor. We actually get a very large amount of armor thanks to the fact that we're going to be reperform with intelligence. We grab some intelligence, and we also get the flat armor based on our HP. Eventually, if you want to be very like if you want to min max this build significantly more than I have, you'd go for a pair of boots with HP and movement speed. So you actually get some more HP. You get a chest with HP, helmet with HP. You want to get as much HP as possible and a little bit of increased armor because that's a more efficient way of scaling armor on Lich than like just getting, percent and flat armor. But I didn't really get to choose what gear I put on, so it doesn't really matter now, does it? Now let's talk about actual gear, shall we? So you do not need you do not need a wrong warp with cast speed. This is merely luxury. A wrong warp itself is plenty good, because yeah, wrong warp. Then of course our helmet here, which is crit chance, spell damage, health. Eventually, you'd want cooldown recovery speed, but area is pretty good too because it makes up. First off, it makes up for the fact that we didn't grab area here. It also makes our explosions bigger. It makes our death waves bigger. It makes everything we do bigger. It makes our blood splatters bigger. So area is really strong affix for us to have for clear. Of course, amulet here just this is supposed to be crit multi, but I didn't really get the luxury of choosing what I got on this amulet. This chest, I actually got the luxury of choosing what I got on this chest, and I'm pretty happy with it. This gives us an insane amount of critical strike chance. This makes up for the fact because, like, we essentially get all of our percent damage from our interaction with wrong warp and movement speed, meaning that we can essentially afford everything else being critical strike chance, which is really cool. I really like that. Of course, catalyst here, crit multi, of course. Rings here, a little bit of mana regen. You want to be a little bit over 15 mana regen. We don't actually spend mana like much at all other than Death Seal and all that. So we don't actually need mana at all. We just need to be able to sustain the 15 degen from Signet of Agony so we're not constantly turning off our bunkers. So just a little bit of mana regen to get over to 16 is wonderful. Belt here, you go for a much better belt with physical damage percentage, cleanse, and all that. I just didn't have one lying around, so I just went with HP. Same thing with here, copper ring with crit, fizz damage, life, because we want to get to 100% crit chance. It's kind of our goal here is to get as much crit chance as humanly possible. And of course, our gloves here, cast speed, of course, area is really cool. You could go for intelligence as well for more armor. One thing of crit avoid HP as well. We do have a pair of double movement speed boots. I would say that wrong warp probably isn't worth investing into unless if you have a pair of double movement speed boots like I have. It could be any pair of boots, to be honest. It's really up to you. I just had a Blood of the Exile sitting around and it has insane synergy because not only does it give me increased armor, it also gives me flat armor from the intelligence and gives me increased damage. And of course, the movement speed is insane with the increased damage it gives. So technically, you could get away with an exalted movement speed pair of boots, but this is definitely something that you would want to have eventually. Like I said, this is not a cheap build. This is a very high investment build. So just be ready for that. And of course, mana regen, crit multi, endurance. You do want to cap your endurance because you're sitting at your endurance like constantly. So you do want to cap your endurance specifically because of that. And of course, like resistance for idols, just cooldown recovery speed with transplant. This will eventually make it really good once we actually have more transplant cooldown from wrong warp right. Increased damage will transformed. And what's really nice about this build is all the other idols that we could ever get kind of suck, to be honest with you. In this build, you get like crit chance idols. So if you don't end up with as much crit chance, you can go for crit chance with physical crit or just normal crit. Or you could just go resistance idols and then go really crazy with all of your items, right? Like whatever items you want to grab. So you can also grab HP idols if you end up with like more resistance than you were bargaining for. But pretty much that's it for the character. That's it for the build. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Like I said, this is a very high investment build. Don't complain to me that you can't set this up. So that being said, this has been Dread. Off to go do something else. Bye, and probably a lot of farming.